Dawn broke over the Montana mountains, painting the rugged peaks in hues of amber and gold. The rising sun cast long shadows across the wilderness, revealing a solitary figure perched on a rocky outcrop. Caleb Hawkins watched the small town of Silver Creek come to life in the valley below his weathered face, partially hidden behind a wild beard that had grown unchecked for years. His long hair streaked with premature gray, whipped in the morning breeze. 5 years. 5 years since he'd walked among ordinary folk. 5 years of solitude with only the mountains, the wildlife, and his memories for company. 5 years since he'd spoken more than a handful of words to another human being. Caleb unfolded the crumpled notice in his hand, the paper worn from being read countless times. The bold letters stood out starkly against the yellowed background. Special auction. Settlement of debt to Judge Webster. Sunday 10 a.m. Silver Creek Church. His calloused fingers tightened around the paper until his knuckles whitened. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, despite his years in the wilderness, fixed on a building in the town center, the American flag hanging limp in the still morning air. "Finally found you, Webster," he whispered, his voice rough from disuse. He tucked the notice into his buckskin jacket and checked his rifle and hunting knife with practiced precision. The weapons had been his constant companions, keeping him alive in the wilderness. Today, they might serve a different purpose. After 5 years of hiding in these mountains, today was the day Caleb Hawkins would walk among men again, and perhaps the day Ezekiel Webster would answer for his crimes. The Silver Creek Church stood at the heart of town, its white steeple reaching toward heaven as if in supplication for the sins committed beneath its roof. On any ordinary Sunday, it would be filled with the faithful singing hymns and seeking redemption. Today, it housed a different sort of gathering. Inside, townsfolk crowded the pews and stood along the walls, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and discomfort. At the altar, where Reverend Collins usually delivered his sermons about Christian charity, stood a wooden platform hastily constructed for the day's business. Abigail Sullivan stood atop this makeshift auction block, her hands bound before her with rough rope that chafed her wrists. Though her head was bowed, her posture spoke not of defeat, but of quiet dignity. Her auburn hair fell in waves around her full face, partially concealing features that might have been considered pretty if not for the circumstances, and if the townsfolk hadn't long ago decided that her fuller figure made her less desirable than the willowy girls who attracted suitors with ease. In the corner of the church, slumped in the last pew with a half-empty whiskey bottle clutched in his trembling hand, sat Silas Sullivan. Once a respected merchant, now a shell of a man drowning in alcohol and debt since his wife's death 3 years ago. He couldn't bring himself to look at his daughter on the auction block, his shame momentarily stronger than his addiction. Judge Ezekiel Webster sat in the front row, impeccably dressed in a fine suit that set him apart from the miners, farmers, and shopkeepers of Silver Creek. His silver hair and patrician features gave him an air of authority that had served him well in his rise to power. But those who looked closely enough might notice the coldness in his eyes, like frost on a winter window pane. "Ladies and gentlemen," called the auctioneer, a small, nervous man who usually sold livestock and homestead goods, "we are gathered here today for a special proceeding." He cleared his throat. "Miss Abigail Sullivan is being auctioned to settle her father's debt of $100 to Judge Webster. She can cook so and has some knowledge of herbal remedies." He paused, clearly uncomfortable with the proceedings. "The starting bid is $50. The church fell silent. Most townsfolk looked at their boots or exchanged uncomfortable glances. A few men smirked. One or two considered the proposition with calculating eyes. "I'll clear the debt for her," Judge Webster announced smoothly, rising to his feet. "But let's allow everyone their fair chance, shall we?" His smile never reached his eyes. "After all, this is a legal proceeding." Minutes passed with only a few half-hearted bids reaching $60. The auctioneer looked nervously between Webster and the crowd. $60 going once. Maxwell Max Cooper Webster's right-hand man stepped forward from his position against the wall. Tall and lean, with a gunslinger's steady hands and watchful eyes, he carried an air of controlled danger. He drew his pistol and placed the barrel against Abigail's temple. "Now we get to the interesting part," Max drawled, though something in his eyes didn't match his cruel words. "The lady's getting impatient." A collective gasp rose from the assembled townsfolk. Even in Silver Creek, where the law bent to Webster's will, this crossed a line that shocked them. "This ain't right," someone muttered. Silence, Webster commanded. This woman's father owes a debt. In civilized society, debts must be paid. The church doors swung open with a bang that echoed like thunder through the hushed building. Sunlight streamed in, silhouetting the massive figure that filled the doorway. Caleb Hawkins had to duck to enter the church, his imposing height forcing him to stoop beneath the frame. As he straightened to his full height, the crowd instinctively stepped back. Whispers rippled through the congregation. The mountain man, the wild one. That's him, the hermit from the high country. Caleb moved forward with the deliberate grace of a predator, his buckskin clothing and wolf fur mantle marking him as a man apart from civilization. His beard and long hair might have made him look savage, but his eyes, clear, alert, and intelligent, told a different story. "Lower your gun," he commanded, his voice deep and resonant after years of silence. Max hesitated, his pistol still pressed against Abigail's temple. His eyes flicked toward Webster, seeking direction. Caleb continued his steady advance down the aisle, his gaze never leaving Max. The congregation parted before him like water around a boulder. When he reached the front of the church, he reached into his jacket and withdrew a leather pouch that clinked with the unmistakable sound of gold coins. He tossed it onto the floor where it landed with a heavy thud. "I'm not buying her," Caleb declared, his voice filling the church. "People aren't property." He looked directly at Webster now, recognition and old hatred flaring between them like sparks from flint and steel. "I'm settling her father's debt." Webster rose to his feet, his face flushing with anger. "This is unacceptable. This is a legal arrangement. The young woman has been advertised. The auction has commenced." Caleb drew his hunting knife in one fluid motion that made several onlookers gasp. But instead of threatening anyone, he stepped onto the platform and cut the ropes binding Abigail's wrists. As the fibers parted, he noticed the red welts where the rough hemp had cut into her skin. He shrugged off his fur-lined coat and draped it gently over her shoulders. The garment enveloped her like a tent, carrying the sense of pine wood smoke and open air. "What does the law say about putting a gun to an innocent woman's head, Judge?" Caleb asked, pronouncing the title like a curse. Webster's face darkened further. "I know you," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "Lieutenant Caleb Hawkins, the man who abandoned his men at Buena Vista." A murmur ran through the church. The Mexican-American War had ended only months ago, but its stories had reached even this remote corner of the Montana Territory. Caleb didn't flinch. "And I know you, Colonel Webster, the man who ordered his troops to fire on civilians, then left his men to die in his place." The tension in the room pulled taut as a bowstring. Several people near the door slipped outside, sensing violence in the air. Max raised his pistol again, this time aiming at Caleb, but the mountain man moved with surprising speed. In a blur of motion, his knife pinned Max's sleeve to the wooden pulpit, the blade sinking deep into the oak. The gun clattered to the floor. Caleb turned to Abigail, whose eyes had widened at the exchange. For the first time, she looked directly at him, taking in the fierce exterior and the pain that lingered in the depths of his gaze. "Do you want to leave this place?" he asked quietly. His voice meant only for her ears. Abigail hesitated just long enough to glance at her father, still slumped in the back pew, unable to meet her eyes. Something hardened in her expression, a decision made. "Yes," she said, her voice small but firm. As they moved toward the door, Silas Sullivan stumbled to his feet, swaying slightly from the whiskey. "My daughter, you can't just—" Caleb stopped and turned to face the broken man. "You lost the right to call her your daughter when you put a price on her head," he said, his voice devoid of mercy but not cruel. "She'll be safe. That's more than you could promise her." No one moved to stop them as they walked out of the church into the bright Montana morning. They followed a creek that wound its way out of town, its cheerful babbling a stark contrast to the grim events of the morning. When they'd put a mile between themselves and Silver Creek, Caleb stopped beside the water. "You should drink," he said, gesturing to the clear stream, "and rest a moment." Abigail knelt by the water's edge, cupping her hands to bring the cool liquid to her lips. The simple act reminded her how parched she was. How long had it been since she'd had water? The night before, she'd been too terrified to eat or drink, knowing what morning would bring. Caleb handed her a strip of dried venison from a pouch at his belt. "Eat." She accepted it gratefully, suddenly aware of the hollow ache in her stomach. They sat in silence for a time, the rustle of leaves and the conversation of birds, the only sounds around them. Why did you help me? Abigail finally asked, studying the stranger who had upended her fate with such decisive action. Caleb gazed back towards Silver Creek, now hidden behind the rolling hills. I came to kill Webster, not to save you. His blunt honesty startled her. Then why didn't you? He turned to look at her, really look at her perhaps for the first time. Because I saw you first. A pause as something shifted in his weathered face. The world has taken enough. Today I wanted to give something back. Abigail reached into the small bag she'd been allowed to keep with her, her only possession apart from the clothes she wore. From it, she withdrew a small jar of salve. Your hand is bleeding, she observed, nodding toward a cut on his palm where the knife had sliced him during the confrontation with Max. Before he could object, she opened the jar and applied a small amount of the herbal mixture to his wound. The salve smelled of pine and something medicinal. You know about herbs? Caleb asked, surprise evident in his voice. My mother taught me. She was the best healer in the region until... Abigail trailed off the pain, still too fresh despite the years. Until Webster wouldn't let her treat his wife, then blamed her when she died. Caleb finished, causing Abigail to look up in shock. How could you possibly know that? I know many things, Miss Sullivan, that's why I'm here. He stood abruptly, ending the conversation. We should keep moving. They'll come after us. Where are we going? She asked, rising to her feet and adjusting his massive coat around her shoulders. Somewhere safe, was all he said, leading her deeper into the wilderness. The journey took them steadily upward, following game trails that grew progressively steeper and narrower. Though Abigail had lived her whole life in Silver Creek, nestled in the mountains, she had never ventured this far into the high country. By mid-afternoon, her legs ached and her breath came in gasps, unaccustomed to the thin air and the relentless pace Caleb set. He noticed her struggling and slowed his stride. Not much farther, he said, offering his hand to help her over a particularly steep section of trail. His palm was rough with calluses but warm against her smaller hand. For a fleeting moment, Abigail felt something oddly like safety in that simple contact, the first gentle human touch she'd experienced in longer than she cared to remember. They crested a ridge and Caleb's cabin came into view in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. It was modest but solidly built with a stone chimney and a small covered porch. Nearby stood a lean-to shelter that served as a barn for a single horse, which nickered softly at their approach. You built this yourself? Abigail asked, impressed by the craftsmanship evident in the sturdy structure. Caleb nodded. Took me most of that first winter. He led her inside where the interior proved as practical and Spartan as the man himself. A fireplace dominated one wall with a cook stove beside it. A rough-hewn table and chair occupied the center of the room. A narrow bed with a thick fur coverlet stood in one corner, while shelves lined another wall holding books, jars, and various implements. What caught Abigail's attention, however, was the small garden visible through the single window, a carefully tended plot containing dozens of plants she recognized as medicinal herbs, along with some she'd never seen before. The garden, she said, moving to the window. Those herbs, some of them are rare. Sarah taught me about them, Caleb explained, stoking the embers in the fireplace to bring the fire back to life. She's Blackfoot. She healed me after I lost everything. He didn't elaborate and Abigail didn't press. She understood loss well enough to recognize its shadows in others. You can take the bed, he said, gesturing to the corner. I'll sleep by the fire. I couldn't. You can and you will, he interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. You've had a harder day than most. As darkness fell outside, Caleb prepared a simple meal of rabbit stew that had been simmering in a pot near the fire. He served it in wooden bowls with a chunk of hardtack bread that Abigail suspected might break teeth if not softened in the stew first. They ate in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. After the tumult of the day, the quiet felt like a balm. When they finished, Abigail insisted on washing the dishes in the basin of water Caleb had brought in from the stream that ran behind the cabin. Why does Webster hate you? She asked as she worked, unable to contain her curiosity any longer. What happened between you? Caleb sat by the fire, staring into the flames. For a long moment, Abigail thought he wouldn't answer. We served together in the war, he finally said. Webster was my commanding officer at Buena Vista. He gave an order to fire on a village of civilians to flush out Mexican soldiers he believed were hiding there. His hands clenched into fists. When I refused and tried to stop the others, he had me arrested for insubordination. He paused, the firelight casting deep shadows across his face. That night, Mexican forces counterattacked. Webster fled, leaving his men to die. I broke free in the chaos and managed to save a few soldiers, but not enough. Not nearly enough. Is that when you came here to Montana? Caleb nodded. Webster reported me as a deserter and a traitor. There was a price on my head. I headed north as far as I could go. A bitter smile twisted his lips. Ironic that he ended up here too, isn't it? A judge of all things. How did you know about my mother? Abigail asked, returning to his earlier comment. I've been watching Silver Creek for months, learning what I could about Webster's life here, he admitted. Your mother's story was told to me by Sarah. The Blackfoot have their own networks of information. Abigail set the clean dishes on the shelf. And now what happens now that Webster knows you're alive? Now, Caleb said, rising to his feet, we prepare. He won't let either of us go easily. In Silver Creek, Judge Webster paced the floor of his office, rage emanating from him like heat from a furnace. The room was the finest in town, with imported furniture and a large oak desk that emphasized his authority. Currently, that desk bore the brunt of his anger as he slammed his fist down on its polished surface. Find them, he bellowed at Max Cooper, who stood impassively near the door. I want Hawkins alive. I want to see him hang. And the girl, Max asked, his voice carefully neutral. Webster waved a dismissive hand. She's nothing, a means to an end. Then why pursue her at all? Hawkins paid the debt. Webster's eyes narrowed dangerously. Are you questioning me, Cooper? Just trying to understand the mission, sir, Max replied smoothly. The mission, Webster said through clenched teeth, is to capture a dangerous deserter and traitor to the United States. The girl is likely his accomplice now. That's all you need to understand. After Max left, Webster locked the door and moved to a hidden safe behind a painting of President Polk. From it, he withdrew a leather-bound journal, flipping through its pages until he found what he sought, a list of names most crossed out. One name remained unmarked, Caleb Hawkins. You should have stayed dead in the mountains, Webster muttered, tracing the name with his finger. Now I'll have to finish what I started in Mexico. Across town, in a modest house that served as both home and medical office, Dr. Thomas Franklin sat with Silas Sullivan. The doctor was in his 60s, with kind eyes magnified by wire-rimmed spectacles and hands that, despite their age, remained steady when treating patients. He handed Silas a cup of strong coffee, hoping to sober him up. You've made a terrible mistake, Silas, Franklin said, his voice gentle but reproachful. Rachel would never have wanted this for Abigail. I had no choice, Silas cried, his bloodshot eyes filling with tears. Webster was going to kill me. You don't understand what he's capable of. I understand better than you think, the doctor replied quietly. Webster has taken more than your wife from you. Now he's taken your daughter too. Silas looked up sharply. What do you mean, more than my wife? Rachel killed herself. The shame of failing to save Mrs. Webster was too much for her, Doctor. Franklin removed his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Rachel didn't commit suicide, Silas. Not the way people think. He hesitated, weighing his words carefully. She discovered something about Webster, something that made her dangerous to him. What are you saying? Silas whispered, suddenly sober. Rachel found out that Webster was using his position as judge to seize land from the native tribes and poor settlers, forging documents and threatening anyone who stood in his way. She confronted him, said she would expose him. Franklin's voice grew heavy with regret. She was found hanged the next day. No, Silas shook his head in denial. No, she left a note. I found it myself. A note in handwriting that resembled hers but wasn't quite right, Franklin said softly. I noticed it at the time, but I was afraid to speak up. Webster had already established himself as the power in Silver Creek by then. Silas stared into his coffee cup, the revelation sinking in like a stone in water, sending ripples through everything he thought he knew. All this time, I blamed her for leaving us. I blamed myself for not being enough to keep her here. His voice broke. And now I've given Abigail to the man who murdered her mother. Not given, Franklin corrected. That mountain man Hawkins, he took her away from Webster. There might still be hope for Abigail. Who is he, this Hawkins? Franklin shook his head. I don't know much, only rumors. They say he was a soldier who turned against his own men, but others claim he was a hero who tried to stop a massacre. He paused. One thing seems certain: he and Webster have a history, and it's not a friendly one. Silas set down his cup with trembling hands. I have to help her. Somehow I have to make this right. Be careful, Silas, Franklin warned. Webster won't hesitate to add another Sullivan to his list of victims. Days passed in the high country cabin, falling into a rhythm neither Abigail nor Caleb had anticipated. She learned the daily routines necessary for survival in the wilderness: how to maintain the fire, where to find the freshest water, which plants could be harvested from the garden for food and medicine. Caleb, for his part, found himself speaking more than he had in years. He taught Abigail how to use a knife for protection, how to read animal tracks, how to move quietly through the forest. She was a quick study, her intelligence evident in her questions and observations. In the evenings, she would prepare salves and tinctures from the herbs in the garden, explaining their properties to Caleb as she worked. He listened with genuine interest, occasionally adding knowledge he'd gained from Sarah about plants used in Blackfoot healing traditions. On the fourth night, Abigail was awakened by sounds of distress. In the dim glow of the banked fire, she saw Caleb thrashing in his bedroll, his face contorted in what could only be a nightmare. No, he muttered, his voice anguished. Get them out. The village is burning. Rebecca, Abigail hesitated, uncertain whether to wake him. Before she could decide, he bolted upright, a cry dying on his lips as he returned to consciousness. He looked around wildly before his eyes found her recognition slowly replacing the terror in his gaze. I'm sorry, he said, roughly running a hand over his face. I didn't mean to wake you. It's all right, she assured him. I have nightmares too. He nodded, then rose and went to the door, stepping outside into the cool night air. After a moment's hesitation, Abigail followed, wrapping his coat, which he'd insisted she keep using around her nightdress. Caleb stood on the porch, his face turned up to the vast canopy of stars overhead. In the mountains far from any town's lights, the night sky revealed itself in all its glory, a river of stars flowing across the heavens. Who is Rebecca? Abigail asked softly, coming to stand beside him. For a long moment he didn't answer, and she thought he might refuse. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and filled with a grief that time had not diminished. My wife, he said. She died in Mexico during the war. I'm sorry, Abigail said and meant it. Loss was something she understood all too well. She was Colonel Webster's daughter, Caleb continued, surprising her with this revelation. We married against his wishes. He never thought a lieutenant was good enough for her. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. She didn't care what he thought. Rebecca had a mind of her own. What happened to her? Abigail asked gently. She followed the regiment as a nurse. When Webster ordered the attack on the village, she went there to help the women and children. His voice grew tight. The village was set ablaze. I tried to reach her, but by the time I fought my way through, he trailed off, unable to finish. And Webster blamed you. Abigail guessed the pieces falling into place. Caleb nodded, his profile stark against the star-filled sky. In his mind, if I had obeyed his orders, the village would have been cleared before the counterattack. If I hadn't married her, she wouldn't have been there at all. His hands gripped the porch railing. He needed someone to blame besides himself. I was convenient. They stood in silence for a time, sharing the weight of their separate losses under the same vast sky. My mother would have liked you, Abigail said eventually. She always said the measure of a person was what they did when no one was watching. Standing up against that order, even when it cost you everything, she would have respected that. Caleb turned to look at her, seeing beyond the fullness of her figure to the strength and compassion that radiated from within. In that moment, something shifted between them, a recognition of kindred spirits, both shaped by tragedy, but not broken by it. Your mother must have been a remarkable woman, he said quietly. She was... Abigail agreed, a sad smile touching her lips. I wish you could have known her. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from the edge of the forest, observing their conversation before slipping away into the darkness. The next morning, Caleb took Abigail deeper into the forest to gather specific herbs that grew only in the shadowy undergrowth beneath the oldest pines. She knelt to harvest a patch of bloodroot, carefully digging around the roots to preserve the plant. This can stop bleeding, she explained, but it's dangerous if used incorrectly. Mother always said the most powerful medicines are also the most dangerous if misused. Caleb nodded, keeping watch as she worked. Despite the peaceful surroundings, he remained vigilant, his instincts honed by years in the wilderness, and before that by war. A twig snapped somewhere to their left. In an instant, Caleb had his rifle raised, pushing Abigail behind him with his other hand. "Don't move," he whispered. They waited tense and silent as Caleb scanned the forest. Nothing moved except the dappled shadows as sunlight filtered through the pine boughs overhead. Then a voice called out, "I'm alone and unarmed. I just want to talk." Abigail gasped as Max Cooper stepped into the small clearing, his hands raised to show he carried no weapon. "Give me one reason not to shoot you where you stand." Caleb growled, his rifle still trained on the gunslinger's chest. "Because I'm not here for Webster," Max replied calmly. "I'm here because of Dr. Franklin." "The town doctor?" Abigail asked, confused. "What does he have to do with this?" Max's expression softened slightly when he looked at her. "He's my uncle, Miss Sullivan, and he sent me to warn you Webster's gathered a posse. They're coming for you both, and they're not planning to take you alive." Caleb's eyes narrowed in suspicion. "Why would Webster's right-hand man betray him?" "Because I've seen enough," Max said simply. "I joined Webster to find out what happened to Sarah Morrison." "Who?" Abigail asked. "A young woman who worked as Webster's housekeeper. She disappeared last year after finding something in his study papers that proved he was stealing land from settlers and native tribes alike." Max's jaw tightened. "She was my fiancée." "Why should we believe you?" Caleb demanded, his rifle unwavering. "Because I could have led Webster straight to you days ago, but I've been leading the search parties in the wrong direction instead." Max reached slowly into his pocket and withdrew a folded paper. "This is a map showing their planned route tomorrow. They'll be here by noon." Caleb finally lowered his rifle and took the map, studying it carefully. "If this is a trap—" "It's not," Max interrupted. "Webster killed Sarah just like he killed Mrs. Sullivan. I've been gathering evidence against him for months, but I need more, something concrete that will convince even his friends in the territorial government." "My mother," Abigail stepped forward, her heart pounding. "What do you know about my mother's death?" Max looked genuinely regretful. "Only what Dr. Franklin told me. She discovered Webster's land scheme and threatened to expose him. Her suicide was staged." Abigail felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. She had always suspected there was more to her mother's death than the official story, but to hear it confirmed so bluntly made her dizzy with grief and rage. "Why didn't Dr. Franklin ever say anything?" she demanded. "Fear," Max answered simply. "Webster made examples of those who crossed him. But now with Hawkins here," he looked at Caleb, "you're the first person who stood up to him in years. It's given others courage." Caleb folded the map and tucked it into his jacket. "We need to move. If what you say is true, this cabin isn't safe anymore." "There's something else," Max said hesitantly. "Your father is looking for you, Miss Sullivan. He's sober for the first time in years, and he's desperate to make amends." Abigail's expression hardened. "He sold me at auction. There are some things that can't be undone." "People make terrible mistakes when they're broken," Max said quietly. "Sometimes they find their way back." She turned away, unable to process this additional shock. Caleb moved to her side, not touching her, but offering his solid presence as support. "We'll gather what we need and go," he said to Max. "Can you delay the search parties further?" Max nodded. "I'll do what I can. Meet me at Widow's Peak in 3 days if you can. I might have more information by then." After Max departed, Abigail and Caleb returned to the cabin in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. As they packed essentials for their journey, food, medicines, weapons, Abigail finally spoke. "Do you believe him?" Caleb considered the question carefully. "I believe he has his own reasons for turning against Webster. Whether those align with our interests remains to be seen." "And what about my father?" she asked, her voice smaller than she intended. Caleb paused in his preparations to look at her directly. "That's a question only you can answer, Abigail. Some betrayals cut too deep to heal. Others—" he glanced at the herbs she was carefully wrapping in cloth. "Some wounds given time and proper care can mend stronger than before." She nodded, appreciating his honesty and the space he gave her to make her own choice. As they finished packing, Abigail noticed a small medallion hanging from a leather cord around Caleb's neck, something she hadn't seen before, as it was usually hidden beneath his shirt. The sight of it stopped her breath. "Where did you get that?" she asked, pointing to the silver pendant. Caleb touched it self-consciously. It was a gift a long time ago." "From whom?" Abigail pressed an impossible suspicion forming in her mind. He seemed reluctant to answer, but finally said, From your mother, Rachel. Before I left for the war, she said it would protect me. Abigail stared at him in shock, the world tilting beneath her once again. You knew my mother. Caleb met her gaze steadily. Yes, Rachel and we were close before I joined the army, before she married your father. How close? Abigail whispered, though she feared she already knew the answer. We were to be married, he said quietly. But when I returned from my first deployment, she had wed Silas Sullivan and was expecting a child. You. Abigail felt as if she'd been struck. All her life she'd believed in the great love story her parents shared, how they'd met when her father's trading caravan passed through town, how they'd fallen in love at first sight. Now in the span of a day, she'd learned that her mother had been murdered and had loved another man before her father. Why didn't you tell me? She demanded, anger flaring to mask her confusion. Would it have helped? Caleb asked simply. Would knowing that your mother once cared for a man who couldn't offer her security, who left her to fight in a war with no guarantee of return, make your current situation any easier? The rational part of Abigail knew he was right, but emotions rarely bow to reason. You should have told me, she insisted. You had no right to keep this from me. Perhaps not, he conceded. But we have more pressing concerns at the moment. Webster's men will be here tomorrow. As if to punctuate his words, a distant sound reached them, the baying of hounds, faint but unmistakable. They're coming, Caleb said grimly, and they're coming now. The baying of hounds grew louder, echoing through the forest like the wails of restless spirits. Caleb moved with practiced efficiency, gathering only what they couldn't afford to lose: his rifle ammunition, Abigail's herbs, a water skin, and a small bundle of dried meat. We need to mask our scent, he said, tossing Abigail a small pouch of pungent dried leaves. Crush these and rub them on your clothes and skin. She complied without question, the herbal mixture stinging her nose with its potent aroma. It smelled of sage pine and something else she couldn't identify. Indian tobacco and skunk cabbage, Caleb explained, noting her expression as he applied the mixture to his own clothing. Sarah taught me. Dogs hate it. They slipped out the back of the cabin and into the deep forest beyond. Instead of heading uphill as Abigail expected, Caleb led her down toward a narrow creek that tumbled over moss-covered stones. We'll follow the water, he said, his voice low. It'll hide our tracks and scent. The creek bed was slippery with algae, and the cold mountain water numbed Abigail's feet through her worn boots. She struggled to keep her balance on the uneven stones, painfully aware that a single misstep could mean a twisted ankle or worse. Caleb moved ahead of her, sure-footed as a mountain goat despite his size. Occasionally he would turn and offer his hand at particularly treacherous sections, his grip strong and reassuring. Neither spoke the urgency of their flight and the lingering tension from their revelations hanging between them like morning mist. After what seemed like hours of careful progress downstream, the baying of the hounds grew fainter, then stopped altogether. Caleb paused, listening intently to the forest sounds around them. They've lost the trail, he whispered, satisfaction evident in his voice. But they'll keep searching. We need to find shelter before nightfall. The sun was already sinking toward the western peaks, the light taking on the golden quality of late afternoon. Shadows lengthened across the forest floor, and the temperature began to drop with the coming evening. There's a place, Caleb said, his eyes scanning the ridgeline above them. A cave Sarah showed me about 2 miles from here. It's defensible and has a hidden entrance. They left the creek, climbing a steep slope covered in pine needles and loose shale. Abigail's legs burned with the effort, unused to such demanding terrain, despite her days at the cabin. Just when she thought she couldn't take another step, Caleb stopped before what appeared to be a solid rock face partially covered by a cascading curtain of vines. He pushed aside the vegetation to reveal a narrow opening, barely wide enough for his broad shoulders to pass through. Stay close behind me, he instructed. It opens up inside. Abigail followed him into the darkness, fighting the instinctive panic of being enclosed in stone. True to his word, the passage widened, after several yards opening into a cavern large enough to stand in comfortably. Dim light filtered through cracks in the ceiling, providing just enough illumination to make out their surroundings. The cave showed signs of previous habitation, a stone ring for a fire, several flat rocks arranged as crude seating, and dry wood stacked neatly against one wall. You've stayed here before, Abigail observed. Caleb nodded, setting down his pack. This was my first shelter when I came to these mountains, before I built the cabin. He began arranging wood in the fire ring. We can risk a small fire. The smoke will disperse through the cracks overhead without being visible from outside. As he worked to start the fire with flint and steel, Abigail sank onto one of the stone seats, the exhaustion of their flight finally catching up with her. Her mind spun with everything she'd learned about her mother, about Caleb, about the web of lies and violence that had shaped her life without her knowledge. Why did she marry my father? She asked, suddenly unable to keep the question inside any longer. If she loved you. Caleb's hands paused briefly in their work before resuming the striking of flint against steel. Sparks flew into the tinder he'd prepared, catching and growing into a small flame. I was reported killed in action, he said, simply feeding the newborn fire with small twigs. The army sent a letter. It was a mistake, another soldier with a similar name, but by the time I returned, 6 months later, Rachel was married to Silas. She thought you were dead. Abigail whispered, her heart aching for the young woman her mother had been grieving, a love she believed lost forever. She made her choice. Caleb continued, his voice neither bitter nor accusatory, merely stating facts. Silas was established, respectable. He could give her security, a place in society. The firelight illuminated the hard planes of his face. I was just a soldier with nothing to offer but promises. But when I came back, she was carrying you. His eyes met hers across the growing fire. She chose to honor her vows to your father. I respected her decision and left for my second deployment. Did my father know about you and my mother? Caleb shook his head. I don't believe so. Rachel wouldn't have wanted to hurt him unnecessarily. Abigail tried to reconcile this new information with her memories of her parents' marriage. They had seemed content together, if not passionately in love. Her father had doted on her mother, and Rachel had been a dutiful wife. But there had been moments, quiet, introspective moments, when her mother would gaze at the mountains with an expression Abigail couldn't decipher as a child. Had she been thinking of Caleb then? After the war, Abigail said, when you came to Montana, did you know she was here? No, Caleb replied, the single word heavy with regret. I chose this place because it was remote, because I could disappear here. I had no idea Rachel had moved to Silver Creek with your father. He stared into the flames. I didn't know until Sarah told me months after I arrived. By then, Rachel was already dead. The cave fell silent except for the gentle crackling of the fire. Outside, the last light of day faded from the sky, leaving them in a cocoon of firelight, surrounded by darkness. I should check our supplies, Caleb said, finally moving to his pack to break the heaviness that had settled between them. Abigail watched him, seeing beyond the gruff exterior to the man beneath, a man who had loved and lost, who had stood by his principles even when it cost him everything, who had saved her without hesitation, despite the danger to himself. For the first time since leaving Silver Creek, she felt the stirring of something beyond gratitude toward him, something that both frightened and intrigued her. Thank you, she said softly. Caleb looked up from his inventory. For what? For telling me the truth about you and my mother, about everything. She managed a small smile. Most men would have lied or avoided the subject entirely. I've seen what lies can do, he replied, to people, to nations. He closed his pack. Truth may hurt, but it doesn't poison the soul like deception. As they shared a sparse meal of jerky and dried berries, Abigail found herself studying Caleb's face in the firelight, searching for what her mother might have seen in this quiet, principled man. Despite his fearsome appearance, there was a gentleness to him that emerged in small moments, the careful way he tended the fire, how he offered her the larger portion of their limited food, the respect with which he spoke of her mother. We should rest, Caleb said, breaking into her thoughts. I'll take first watch. You sleep. Wake me for the second watch, Abigail insisted. You need rest too. He looked as if he might argue, but then nodded in acknowledgement of her determination. 4 hours, then I'll wake you. Abigail settled on the cave floor near the fire, using her pack as a pillow and Caleb's coat as a blanket. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her for a time as her mind replayed the day's revelations. When slumber finally claimed her, her dreams were a confused tangle of past and present. Her mother's face, her father's despair, Webster's cold eyes, and always Caleb watching from the periphery, a silent guardian she could never quite reach. Webster slammed his fist against the trunk of a pine tree, his face contorted with rage. The search party had followed the trail to Hawkins' cabin, only to find it deserted, the scent trail mysteriously vanishing at a nearby creek. "Incompetent fools," he snarled at the men and dogs gathered in the small clearing. "How difficult can it be to track two people through the wilderness?" No one dared answer. The men shifted uncomfortably, avoiding their leader's gaze. Even the Bashtos seemed to cower, perhaps sensing that their failure might result in punishment. Only Max Cooper maintained his composure, leaning against a tree with deceptive casualness. His eyes, however, remained alert, missing nothing. "The mountain man knows these woods better than anyone," he observed, "and he's had years to practice evading pursuit." Webster rounded on him. "I don't recall asking for your assessment, Cooper." Max shrugged, unperturbed by the judge's anger. "Just stating facts. If we want to catch them, we need to think differently." "And how do you suggest we do that?" Webster's voice dripped with sarcasm. "They'll need supplies eventually. They'll have to risk coming down from the mountains at some point." Max straightened from his relaxed posture. "I say we split up. Half the men continue searching the high country, the others set up watches on all the trails and passes that lead to neighboring settlements." Webster studied his lieutenant thoughtfully, anger giving way to calculation. "In which group would you lead, Cooper?" "I'll take the high country, Mom," Max replied without hesitation. "I've spent more time tracking in these mountains than most of the men here." For a long moment, Webster's cold eyes bored into Max's impassive face, searching for any sign of deception. Finally, he nodded. "Very well. Take Johnson Williams and the Blackfoot Scout. The rest will come with me to secure the passes." As the men prepared to separate into their assigned groups, Webster drew Max aside. "I'm trusting you with this, Cooper. Don't disappoint me." "I never have before, sir," Max answered smoothly. "See that you don't start now." Webster's hand moved to rest meaningfully on the pistol at his hip. "I would hate to add your name to the list of those who've betrayed my confidence." Max's expression revealed nothing but a cold fury ignited in his chest at the thinly veiled threat. "Understood, Judge. Crystal clear." As Webster's group departed toward the lower trails, Max turned to his smaller team. "Johnson, you and Williams circle north. The Blackfoot Scout and I will head east. Meet back at the cabin at sundown." Once the others were out of earshot, Max turned to the native tracker. "Two Gold Eagles say you can lead Webster's men on a long, fruitless chase while I attend to other business." The Blackfoot man's weathered face cracked in a rare smile. "3 Eagles," Max chuckled. "Done." He handed over the coins. "Make it convincing, but keep them far from Widow's Peak." The tracker nodded once, pocketing the gold, then melted into the forest as silently as a shadow. Alone now, Max set off at a rapid pace, not toward the east as he'd claimed, but northwest toward the rendezvous point he had arranged with Hawkins and Abigail. His betrayal of Webster was now in motion, and there would be no turning back. In Silver Creek, Dr. Franklin's small clinic had an unexpected visitor. Silas Sullivan sat on the examination table, allowing the doctor to clean and bandage a deep cut on his forearm. "You're lucky it didn't hit an artery," Franklin admonished, tightening the bandage. "What possessed you to break into Webster's office in broad daylight?" "I had to know," Silas replied, his face haggard but his eyes clearer than they had been in years. 3 days of sobriety had aged him a decade, the accumulated grief he had been drowning in whiskey, now fully visible in the lines of his face. "I had to see for myself if what you told me was true." "And did you find what you were looking for?" Silas reached into his jacket with his uninjured arm and withdrew a folded document. Land deeds, dozens of them with forged signatures or signed under duress, some belonging to settlers who mysteriously disappeared or died in accidents. Others from native tribal leaders who supposedly ceded territories they would never willingly give up. Franklin carefully took the papers, adjusting his spectacles to examine them. "This is evidence of fraud, certainly, but how does it connect to Rachel's death?" "This was hidden with them," Silas said, producing a small leather-bound book. "Rachel's journal. The last entry," his voice broke. "The last entry is dated the day she died. It says she confronted Webster about the land schemes and threatened to send evidence to the territorial governor." The doctor leafed through the journal, his face growing graver with each page. "This would be enough to bring Webster's down if we can get it to the proper authorities. That's why I need to find Abigail," Silas insisted, sliding off the examination table. "I need to warn her. Webster will kill her and that mountain man if he catches them. They need to take this evidence and get it to Helena to the governor's office. Franklin shook his head. You're in no condition to go into the mountains, Silas. You've barely been sober 3 days and now you're injured. I have to try, Silas said, his voice rising. She's all I have left. I've failed her in every way a father can fail a daughter. I won't fail her in this. The doctor sighed, recognizing the determination in the broken man's eyes. At least wait until tomorrow. Let me see if Max can get word to them first. He's in the search party, but Franklin hesitated. He's not as loyal to Webster as he appears. Cooper, Silas asked incredulously. Webster's attack dog. Why would he help us? Because Webster had someone he loved killed as well, Franklin explained. My niece Sarah Morrison. She was engaged to Max before she disappeared last year after working in Webster's household. Silas absorbed this information, his expression shifting from disbelief to grim understanding. How many lives has that monster destroyed? Too many, Franklin replied softly. But perhaps with these documents and Rachel's journal, we can ensure he destroys no more. Morning came to the hidden cave in thin streams of light filtering through the ceiling cracks. Abigail woke to find Caleb already up checking his rifle at the cave entrance. Despite her insistence on taking a watch, he had let her sleep through the night. You didn't wake me, she accused, sitting up and pushing hair from her face. You needed the rest more than I needed sleep, he replied, not looking up from his task. That wasn't your decision to make, she countered, rising to her feet. I'm not helpless, Caleb. If we're in this together, you need to treat me as an equal. That got his attention. He looked up, surprise evident in his expression. You're right, he conceded after a moment. Old habits. I've been alone a long time. Abigail nodded, accepting the apology implicit in his words. What's our plan now? We wait until nightfall, then make our way to Widow's Peak to meet Cooper if he keeps his word. Caleb finished with his rifle and set it aside. I still don't fully trust him, but you trust him enough to meet him. I trust that he has reasons to hate Webster same as us. For now, that's enough. He gestured to their meager supplies. We need information and possibly allies if we're going to survive this. They spent the day in the confines of the cave, conserving energy and speaking little. Abigail sorted through her herbs, checking which had survived their hasty flight. Caleb alternated between keeping watch at the cave entrance and carving a new handle for his hunting knife from a piece of antler. By late afternoon, the enforced inactivity had Abigail pacing the small space. Tell me about Sarah, she said, finally breaking the long silence. The Blackfoot woman who helped you. Caleb's hands stilled on his carving. What do you want to know? Anything. How you met. What she taught you. I just need something to focus on besides our current predicament. He considered her request, then nodded. After Mexico, after everything with Webster and Rebecca, I wandered north. I was wounded physically from the battle, but more deeply in other ways. His voice took on a distant quality, as if he were looking back through the years. I crossed into Blackfoot territory, not caring if they killed me. I think I half hoped they would. But they didn't, Abigail prompted when he fell silent. No, a hunting party found me collapsed near one of their sacred sites. By their laws, they could have killed me as a trespasser. Instead, their medicine woman, Sarah, argued for my life. She said the spirits had led me there for a reason. Did she say what reason? A shadow of a smile touched Caleb's lips. She said that was for me to discover. She took me to her lodge and treated my wounds, both the ones that bled and the ones that didn't. She taught you about healing herbs, Abigail guessed, glancing at her own collection. Among other things. How to track, how to live with the land, rather than fighting against it, how to find peace in silence. He ran a thumb along the edge of his carving. Most importantly, she taught me that survival isn't enough. A man needs purpose to truly live. What purpose did you find? Caleb's eyes met hers, the intensity in them making her breath catch. At first, revenge. I planned to find Webster and kill him for what he did to Rebecca, to the villagers in Mexico, to my men who died following his cowardly orders. And now, Abigail asked softly. Before he could answer, a sound from outside the cave brought both of them to alert stillness. Caleb motioned for silence, reaching for his rifle. He moved to the cave entrance, positioning himself to defend against whoever approached. Footsteps crunched on the rocky ground outside, followed by a voice calling softly, "Hawkins, it's Cooper." Caleb relaxed slightly but kept his rifle ready. Come in slowly. No sudden movements. Max appeared at the entrance alone and apparently unarmed. He raised his hands to show they were empty. I'm alone. I gave Webster's men the slip. You're early for our meeting, Caleb observed, suspicion evident in his tone. Plans changed. Webster's divided the search parties. Half are watching the trails and passes down to the settlements. The others are combing the high country. Max glanced at Abigail. How are you holding up, Miss Sullivan? Well enough, she replied cautiously. What news from town? Max hesitated, his expression growing serious. Your father was injured breaking into Webster's office. Dr. Franklin is treating him. Abigail felt a jolt of concern despite herself. How badly is he hurt? Not life-threatening, a deep cut on his arm. Max reached inside his jacket, slowly telegraphing his movements so as not to alarm Caleb. He found these. He produced a bundle of papers and a small book which he handed to Abigail. Her breath caught as she recognized her mother's journal. Where did he find this? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Hidden in Webster's office, along with land deeds that prove he's been systematically stealing property through fraud and intimidation for years. Max's face hardened. Your mother discovered his scheme and threatened to expose him. That's why she died. Abigail clutched the journal to her chest. Her mother's final words now returned to her like a message from beyond. He murdered her and made it look like suicide. She said the truth she'd long suspected, now confirmed. Yes, Max confirmed, just like he did with Sarah Morrison, my fiancée, when she found the same evidence while working in his house. Caleb had lowered his rifle but remained vigilant. Why bring this to us now? Because this evidence needs to reach the territorial governor in Helena, Max explained. Dr. Franklin and your father believe it's the only way to stop Webster permanently. If he's exposed by official channels, his friends in high places won't be able to protect him. And you want us to deliver it, Caleb guessed. Max nodded. Webster expects you to either hide in the mountains or try to flee the territory. He won't anticipate you heading to Helena. I can create a diversion, lead the search parties further astray while you make your way there. It's at least a week's journey, Caleb pointed out, through difficult terrain with Webster's men watching the passes. There's another way, Max said, the old Trapper's Trail through Shadow Canyon. It's dangerous, narrow passages, potential rock slides, mountain lion territory, but Webster doesn't know about it. It could get you to Helena in 5 days. Abigail looked up from her mother's journal. How do we know this isn't a trap leading us into Shadow Canyon, where Webster's men will be waiting? You don't, Max admitted. You have only my word. But ask yourself this, if I wanted to betray you, why wouldn't I have already led Webster's men here? Caleb and Abigail exchanged a long look, silently weighing their options. We'll need supplies for the journey, Caleb finally said. Food, ammunition, medical supplies. I've cached supplies at the entrance to the canyon, Max replied. Enough to get you to Helena. I've also included civilian clothes for you, Hawkins. You'll attract less attention if you don't look like a mountain man when you reach the capital. When do we leave? Abigail asked, already mentally preparing herself for the journey ahead. Tonight, Max said, under cover of darkness. I'll lead you to the cache, then head back to misdirect the search parties. As Max and Caleb discussed the details of their route, Abigail opened her mother's journal, her fingers trembling slightly as she turned the pages. Rachel Sullivan's neat, precise handwriting filled the small book records of patients, treated herbs, gathered family events noted. The mundane details of a life cut short. She turned to the final entry dated the day of her mother's death. I confronted Webster today about the land deeds. The evidence is undeniable. He's been forcing settlers off their rightful claims, intimidating native leaders into signing away tribal lands, all to build his own empire here in the territory. When I threatened to write to the governor, he laughed, said no one would believe a mere herbalist over a respected judge. But I know what I saw and I cannot remain silent. I've hidden copies of the most damning documents where he'll never find them. Tomorrow I'll send them east with the mail coach. May God forgive him, for I cannot. Tears blurred Abigail's vision as she read her mother's final words. Rachel Sullivan had not been a woman driven to despair by failure, as the town believed. She had been a woman of principle, willing to stand against corruption, even at great personal risk. A woman not unlike the man her daughter now traveled with. The realization that her mother had been murdered, not just died, but was deliberately killed to silence her, ignited a cold fury in Abigail's heart. Webster had not only taken her mother from her, but had twisted the narrative of Rachel's death to destroy her legacy and reputation. Abigail, Caleb's voice broke through her thoughts. Are you all right? She looked up to find both men watching her with concern. I will be, she said, closing the journal carefully. When Webster faces justice for what he's done. As dusk settled over the mountains, the three figures moved silently through the forest, keeping to game trails and shadows. Max led the way with Caleb close behind and Abigail between them for protection. They spoke little each step, taking them further from the relative safety of the cave and closer to the uncertain path ahead. After 2 hours of steady travel, they reached a rocky outcropping that overlooked a vast canyon. Even in the growing darkness, Abigail could make out the sheer walls and narrow passages that cut through the mountains like a wound. Shadow Canyon, Max said quietly, pointing to the ominous gash in the earth. The cache is hidden in a crevice near the entrance, marked with 3 stacked stones. Caleb surveyed the terrain with experienced eyes. How far to the other side? 2 days of hard travel if the weather holds. There's a trapper's cabin midway where you can shelter for a night. Max handed Caleb a crude map drawn on a scrap of leather. The route's marked here. Once you're through the canyon, it's another 3 days to Helena across easier country. And you're certain Webster doesn't know about this path? Abigail asked, still not entirely trusting their newfound ally. The only people who use it are native hunters and a few old mountain men, Max assured her. Webster's men will be watching the main passes and trails. As they prepared to descend toward the canyon entrance, a sudden noise from the forest behind them brought all three to alert stillness. Caleb raised his rifle, scanning the darkened trees. Someone's coming, he whispered. Max drew his pistol. I'll check. You two get to the cave and start through the canyon. Don't wait for me. Before they could argue, he disappeared into the underbrush, moving with the silent efficiency of a practiced hunter. Caleb took Abigail's arm. Come on, we need to reach that cache before full dark. They made their way down the slope toward the canyon entrance, picking their way carefully over loose rocks and exposed roots. The terrain grew increasingly treacherous as they descended, requiring full concentration to avoid a dangerous fall. Just as they reached the canyon floor, a gunshot echoed from the ridge above, followed by a second in quick succession. Max, Abigail breathed, pausing to look back up the slope. Keep moving, Caleb urged. The concern was evident in his voice as well. We can't help him if we're caught too. They found the cache exactly where Max had described, a narrow crevice in the canyon wall, marked by 3 small stones stacked one atop the other. Inside was a canvas pack containing dried meat, hardtack coffee, ammunition, medical supplies, and a set of ordinary clothes that would help Caleb blend in once they reached civilization. As Caleb transferred the supplies to their packs, more gunshots rang out from the ridge, accompanied now by shouts and the baying of hounds. Webster's men found Max, Caleb said grimly. We need to move, now. But if they've caught him, then our best hope of helping him is to get this evidence to Helena, Caleb finished for her. It's what he risked his life for. Abigail knew he was right, but leaving someone behind, even someone she barely knew and didn't fully trust, felt wrong. Nevertheless, she shouldered her pack and followed Caleb into the narrow entrance of Shadow Canyon. The passage closed around them like the throat of some great beast, the walls rising sheer on either side. What little moonlight penetrated the depths cast strange shifting shadows across their path. The air grew noticeably cooler, carrying the mineral scent of damp stone and the distant sound of water flowing somewhere in the darkness ahead. They traveled in silence for nearly an hour, the difficult terrain demanding their full attention. The path, if it could be called that, was little more than a game trail in places barely wide enough for a person to pass. In other sections, they had to scramble over massive boulders that had fallen from the canyon walls over the centuries. When Caleb finally called a halt in a small widening of the canyon, Abigail sank gratefully onto a flat rock, her muscles trembling with exhaustion. The events of the day, the revelations in her mother's journal, the hasty flight from the cave, the gunshots that might have claimed Max's life, all crashed over her in a wave of delayed reaction. Here, Caleb said, offering her the water skin. Small sips. We need to conserve. She took it with murmured thanks, the cool water soothing her parched throat. As she handed it back, their fingers brushed the brief contact, sending an unexpected warmth through her despite her exhaustion. Do you think Max is dead? She asked, needing to voice the fear that had accompanied them into the canyon. Caleb considered the question with characteristic thoroughness. He's resourceful, and he knows these mountains almost as well as I do. He adjusted his pack. But if Webster's men were close enough to hear us talking at the canyon rim, he didn't need to finish the thought. If Max had been captured, he would be forced to reveal their plan. If he was dead, they had lost a valuable ally in their fight against Webster. We should keep moving, Caleb said after a brief rest. The further we get into the canyon tonight, the better our chances. As they prepared to continue their journey, a distant howl echoed through the canyon, not the baying of hounds, but the wild cry of a wolf calling to its pack. Something in the sound resonated deep within Abigail, a primal recognition of another creature seeking its own kind in the vastness of the wilderness. She glanced at Caleb, wondering if he felt it too, that peculiar loneliness that comes from being cut off from one's own people. For 5 years he had lived apart from human society, as much a lone wolf as the animal whose cry still echoed through the canyon. And yet when she needed him most, he had returned to the world of men to save her, a stranger. Or perhaps not entirely a stranger, given his connection to her mother. Caleb, she said impulsively as they started down the trail again, you never answered my question earlier, in the cave. Which question? He asked, his attention seemingly focused on the path ahead. I asked what purpose you found after Sarah taught you that a man needs more than just survival. She watched his profile in the dim light. You said at first it was revenge against Webster. I asked what it was now. He was silent for so long that Abigail thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but clear in the quiet of the canyon. Justice, he said simply. Not just for Rebecca or your mother, but for all those Webster has harmed. The settlers whose land he stole, the native tribes he's displaced, the people of Silver Creek who live under his shadow. He glanced back at her. Revenge is personal. Justice is for everyone. Something in his words struck a chord within her, aligning with values her mother had instilled in her from childhood. Rachel Sullivan had taught her that healing wasn't just about easing physical pain, but about restoring balance and wholeness to a person or a community. My mother would have agreed with you, she said softly. Rachel had a strong sense of right and wrong, Caleb acknowledged that. Stronger than mine in many ways. She saw clearly while I was still blinded by ambition and a young man's certainties. The conversation lapsed as the path narrowed again, requiring single-file travel. Abigail followed Caleb's broad back, trusting his judgment of the terrain even in the growing darkness. Despite the danger of their situation, she felt a curious sense of rightness in their mission, as if the convergence of their separate paths had been inevitable. Hours later, they made camp in a small cave formed by a rock overhang. It offered protection from the elements and concealment from anyone who might be following. Too exhausted for conversation, they shared a simple meal of jerky and hardtack before settling down to rest. I'll take first watch this time. Abigail insisted, her tone allowing no argument. You need sleep too, Caleb. To her surprise, he nodded without protest. Wake me in 4 hours or sooner if you hear anything unusual. As Caleb slept, his massive frame curled awkwardly in the confined space, Abigail kept vigil at the cave entrance. The night was alive with sounds, the whisper of wind through the canyon, the distant call of night birds, the occasional scurrying of small animals in the underbrush. She found comfort in these reminders that life continued its cycles regardless of human concerns. Her hand strayed to the pocket where she kept her mother's journal, the tangible connection to the woman who had shaped her life in so many ways. Rachel Sullivan had been brave enough to stand against Webster's corruption, even knowing the risk. Could her daughter do any less? The events of the past days had transformed Abigail's world completely. A week ago, she had been the unmarried daughter of a broken man, pitied by some in Silver Creek, and dismissed by others due to her fuller figure and quiet nature. Now she was a fugitive on a dangerous mission, carrying evidence that could bring down the most powerful man in the territory. And she was traveling with Caleb Hawkins, a man who existed in town gossip only as the Mountain Man, a near mythical figure who was part boogeyman, part cautionary tale. The real Caleb was more complex than any story, a man of principle who had lost everything, a warrior who chose to live in solitude rather than compromise his values, a healer who carried the knowledge of two cultures, a man who had once loved her mother. That thought still unsettled her, though less acutely than when she'd first learned of it. In the quiet hours of her watch, Abigail found herself wondering what might have been different if her mother had married Caleb instead of Silas Sullivan. Would Rachel still be alive? Would Abigail herself even exist? Such questions had no answers, of course. Life unfolded as it did, not as it might have. All they could do now was move forward, carrying the truth with them like a torch in the darkness. When the time came to wake Caleb for his watch, Abigail found herself reluctant to disturb his sleep. In repose, his face had softened, the lines of hardship and solitude less pronounced. He looked younger, more like the man he must have been before war, and loss carved their signatures into his features. "Caleb," she said softly, touching his shoulder. He woke instantly, fully alert in the space of a heartbeat, the ingrained response of a soldier and a man who had lived in the wilderness where danger could come at any moment. "Your watch," she said, withdrawing her hand. "All quiet so far." He nodded, rising to take her place at the cave entrance. "Get some rest. Tomorrow will be harder." Abigail settled into the warm spot he had vacated, wrapping herself in his coat. As exhaustion pulled her towards sleep, she found herself wondering about the man keeping watch over her and about the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. So, in Silver Creek, Dr. Franklin worked by lamplight in his small clinic, preparing a packet of documents and letters. Across from him sat Silas Sullivan, his injured arm now properly bandaged and supported in a sling. "Are you certain about this, Silas?" the doctor asked, sealing the packet with wax. "Once you start down this path, there's no turning back." "I've spent 3 years drowning my grief in whiskey," Silas replied, his voice steady despite his haggard appearance. "Running from the truth about Rachel's death, failing our daughter in every way possible." He straightened his shoulders. "It's time I stood for something, Thomas. The way Rachel would have wanted." Franklin nodded, impressed by the transformation in the man before him. Grief and alcohol had nearly destroyed Silas Sullivan, but the determination to make amends, to seek justice for his wife, and redemption in his daughter's eyes had given him a strength neither man had known he possessed. "The mail coach leaves for Helena at dawn," Franklin said, handing Silas the sealed packet. "This contains copies of the land deeds and a detailed account of Webster's crimes, along with statements from 3 settlers who were forced off their land. Not as compelling as Rachel's journal, but enough to warrant an investigation if Max doesn't reach the governor." "He won't," came a voice from the doorway. Both men turned to see Max Cooper leaning heavily against the doorframe, blood soaking the left side of his shirt. He staggered into the room, collapsing into a chair as Franklin rushed to examine his wound. "Webster's men," Max gasped as the doctor cut away his shirt to reveal a bullet wound in his shoulder. "They were closer than I thought. Following me." "Did they follow you here?" Silas demanded, moving to peer out the window into the darkened street. Max shook his head. "Lost them in the forest, but they know about the canyon. Heard us talking." He winced as Franklin probed the wound. "Webster sent men to the far end to cut them off. Hawkins and Abigail are walking into a trap." Silas realized, his face paling. "We have to warn them," Franklin said, working quickly to clean Max's wound. "Too late," Max replied, gritting his teeth against the pain. "They're already in the canyon. No way to reach them before Webster's men." Silas looked down at the packet in his hand, then back at the wounded man. A decision crystallized in his mind. "Then we need another plan, one Webster won't expect." "What do you have in mind?" Franklin asked, pausing in his treatment of Max's wound. "Webster thinks all the evidence is with Abigail and Hawkins." Silas explained, his voice gaining strength as the idea took form. "He's focused on stopping them. He won't be watching for a direct approach from another direction." "You can't mean," Franklin began, but Silas cut him off. "Yes, I'm taking these copies to Helena myself, tonight, while Webster's attention is divided." "That's suicide," Max argued weakly. "You'll never make it past his men watching the main roads." "I don't intend to take the main roads," Silas replied with grim determination. "Before the whiskey took hold, I was a trader. I know every back trail and smuggler's route in this territory." Franklin and Max exchanged looks of concern and grudging respect. "You've been sober less than a week, Silas," the doctor reminded him gently. "And you're injured." "And my daughter is in danger because of my failures," Silas countered. "This is my chance to make it right, Thomas. Perhaps my only chance." After a long moment, Franklin nodded. "Very well, but you won't go alone. Jacob Willis owes me a favor. He's a good man with a rifle, and he knows the country." The blacksmith? Silas asked, surprised. His brother was one of the settlers Webster forced out last year, Franklin explained. He's been looking for a way to fight back. Max struggled to sit up straighter. Take the North Passage through Miller's Gulch, he advised. Webster won't have men there, too obvious a route for fugitives to use. As the three men continued planning their desperate countermove, none noticed the shadow that detached itself from the darkness outside the clinic window, a shadow that moved with purpose toward Judge Webster's house on the hill above Silver Creek. Dawn broke over Shadow Canyon, painting the upper walls in gold while the depths remained shrouded in blue shadow. Abigail and Caleb had been moving for an hour already, taking advantage of the cooler morning temperatures for the difficult journey. The path grew increasingly treacherous as they penetrated deeper into the canyon. In places, it narrowed to barely a foot wide, with a sheer drop on one side down to the stream that had carved this passage through the mountains over countless millennia. Stay close to the wall, Caleb instructed as they navigated one such section, and don't look down. Naturally, Abigail immediately glanced down and wished she hadn't. The canyon floor lay at least 100 feet below, rocky and unforgiving. A fall from this height would mean certain death. She pressed her back against the cool stone of the canyon wall, inching forward with deliberate care. Caleb had gone ahead and now stood on a wider section of path, watching her progress with alert concern. You're doing well, he encouraged. Just a few more steps. Just as Abigail neared the safety of the wider ledge, a shower of small stones rained down from above. She looked up in alarm to see a mountain goat dislodging rocks as it traversed the canyon rim far overhead. Before she could react, the loose shale beneath her right foot gave way. She felt herself tilting outward over the terrifying drop, a scream frozen in her throat as gravity claimed her. In that suspended moment between balance and fall, a powerful hand seized her wrist. Caleb, moving with lightning reflexes, had lunged forward to catch her. His grip was like iron as he pulled her to safety, drawing her against his chest in one smooth motion. For several heartbeats, they stood frozen in that embrace, Abigail's pulse thundering in her ears from the near miss. She could feel Caleb's heart pounding as well, his breath warm against her hair. I've got you, he murmured, his voice rough with adrenaline, and something else, something that made her awareness of him sharpen acutely. Slowly, reluctantly, he released her, though his hands remained ready to steady her, if needed. Are you all right? Abigail nodded, not yet trusting her voice. The nearness of death had left her shaken, but something else had unsettled her even more, the realization that in Caleb's arms, she had felt not just safe, but seen in a way she had never experienced before. They continued their journey in silence, each lost in private thoughts. By midday, the character of the canyon had changed. The walls drew further apart and the path descended to follow the stream that flowed along the canyon floor. Vegetation appeared, hardy shrubs and stunted pines that somehow found purchase in the rocky soil. We're making good time, Caleb observed as they paused to rest and eat. If we maintain this pace, we'll reach the trapper's cabin by nightfall. Abigail nodded, sipping water from the skin. And then 2 more days to Helena, assuming the weather holds and we don't encounter any unexpected obstacles. He glanced at the sky, visible in the narrow strip between the canyon walls. There's a storm brewing to the west. We might get rain by tomorrow. As they prepared to resume their journey, a sound echoed through the canyon, the distinctive crack of a rifle shot followed by the ping of a bullet striking stone near their position. Get down, Caleb shouted, pulling Abigail behind a large boulder as a second shot kicked up dust at their feet. Webster's men, she gasped, pressing herself against the rock as more shots followed in quick succession. Caleb peered carefully around the edge of their shelter, jerking back as a bullet chipped stone inches from his face. They've found us, or rather, they've found the exit from the canyon. His expression darkened. They must have captured Max and forced him to reveal our plan. What do we do now? Abigail asked, clutching her mother's journal more tightly. Caleb studied their surroundings with the calculating eye of a tactician. We can't go forward. They have the advantage of position. They could pick us off easily as we approach the canyon exit. So we go back all the way to Silver Creek. He shook his head. Too far, and Webster will have men watching that end too by now. His gaze settled on a narrow crevice in the canyon wall, about 50 yards behind their position. There, that might be our best option. Between bursts of gunfire from their unseen attackers, Caleb explained his plan. The crevice appeared to lead to a series of ledges that climbed the canyon wall. If they could reach those ledges, they might be able to work their way above and around Webster's men. It's risky, he admitted. The climbing will be difficult, and we don't know what we'll find at the top. But staying here or retreating both means certain capture. Abigail considered their options and nodded. I'll follow your lead. When I give the signal, run for that crevice as fast as you can. Don't stop, don't look back. Caleb checked his rifle. I'll cover you, then follow. He waited for a pause in the gunfire, then raised his rifle and fired 3 rapid shots toward their attackers. Now, he shouted, continuing to fire as Abigail sprinted for the crevice. Bullets kicked up dust around her feet as she ran, her heart pounding with fear and determination. She reached the narrow opening and pressed herself into it, turning back to see Caleb firing one final shot before racing after her. He was halfway to the crevice when a shot rang out and he stumbled, clutching his left arm. For a terrible moment, Abigail thought he would fall, but he regained his balance and continued his desperate dash for safety. As bullets continued to pepper the ground around him, Caleb dove into the crevice beside Abigail, his breathing ragged and his face pale beneath his tan. You're hit, she said, already reaching for her pack to find her medical supplies. It's not deep, he assured her, though the spreading bloodstain on his sleeve suggested otherwise. We need to keep moving. They'll be coming after us. Despite his protest, Abigail insisted on a hasty examination of the wound. The bullet had torn through the flesh of his upper arm, missing the bone, but leaving a deep bleeding furrow. This needs proper treatment, she said quickly, applying a field dressing from her supplies. But it will have to wait until we're somewhere safer. With Caleb's wound temporarily bandaged, they began their ascent through the narrow crevice. The passage climbed steeply, requiring them to use hands and feet to navigate the uneven surface. In places, they had to turn sideways to squeeze through particularly tight sections. Caleb led the way despite his injury, testing each handhold and foothold before trusting his weight to it. Abigail followed, mimicking his movements, her muscles burning with the effort. The physical challenge kept her focused, preventing her from dwelling on the men pursuing them or the increasingly precarious nature of their escape plan. After what felt like hours of climbing, the crevice widened and then opened onto a narrow ledge high on the canyon wall. They emerged into the late afternoon sunlight, momentarily blinded after the dimness of the passage. When her eyes adjusted, Abigail gasped at the view. They stood hundreds of feet above the canyon floor, with the vast expanse of wilderness spreading out before them. In the distance, storm clouds gathered over the western peaks, just as Caleb had predicted. But her awe quickly gave way to dismay as she realized their predicament. The ledge they stood on was no more than 3 feet wide, running along the canyon wall for about 50 yards before ending abruptly. There was no obvious path forward or upward from their position. We're trapped, she whispered, the full weight of their situation settling over her like a physical burden. Caleb, who had been examining the canyon below for signs of pursuit, turned to her with unexpected calmness. Not trapped, he corrected, just challenged. He pointed to a series of smaller ledges and cracks that continued upward and around a bulge in the canyon wall. It's a harder climb from here, but still possible. With your injured arm? Abigail asked skeptically. I've managed with worse, he replied, though the tightness around his eyes betrayed the pain he was feeling. Before they could begin this new phase of their ascent, voices echoed up from below. Webster's men had reached the entrance to the crevice and were preparing to follow. We need to move now, Caleb urged, already reaching for the first handhold on their new route. As they began their precarious climb around the canyon wall, Abigail glanced back one last time at the path they had traveled. From this height, Shadow Canyon resembled a great wound in the earth, dark and mysterious. Somewhere within its depths, Webster's men pursued them with single-minded determination. And somewhere beyond the distant mountains lay Helena, where the evidence they carried might finally bring justice for her mother if they survived long enough to deliver it. The storm that had been brewing on the western horizon arrived with sudden fury, transforming the late afternoon sky into a churning mass of slate-gray clouds. Thunder rumbled through Shadow Canyon, echoing off the stone walls like distant artillery. The first heavy raindrops struck Abigail's face as she clung to the rock face, searching desperately for her next handhold. We need shelter, Caleb called from above her, his voice nearly lost in a fresh peal of thunder. There's an overhang about 20 feet up. If we can reach it before the worst hits. He didn't need to finish the thought. They both knew what a deluge would mean on these exposed ledges, slippery rock, reduced visibility, and an almost certain fall. Abigail forced her trembling muscles to continue the climb following Caleb's lead, despite the growing pain in her hands and shoulders. The rain intensified, plastering her clothing to her skin and making the rock treacherously slick. Each handhold became a test of will as much as strength. Below them, the sounds of pursuit had faded, whether due to the storm or because Webster's men had given up the dangerous ascent, she couldn't tell. Caleb reached the overhang, first hauling himself onto the relatively flat space beneath it, with a grimace of pain as his wounded arm took his weight. He turned immediately to help Abigail, extending his good arm down to her. "Just a little further," he encouraged. "You can make it." Abigail stretched upward, her fingers almost touching his, when a gust of wind slammed against the canyon wall. She felt her foot slip on the wet stone, and for the second time that day, she experienced the sickening sensation of falling. Her stomach lurched as gravity reclaimed her. This time, both of Caleb's hands shot out his injured arm. Be damned. He caught her wrist in an iron grip, a grunt of pain escaping him as the sudden weight tore at his wound. For an endless moment, Abigail dangled over the abyss, supported only by Caleb's tenuous hold. "Hold on," he gritted through clenched teeth. "I've got you." With a surge of desperate strength, he pulled her upward. Abigail scrabbled with her feet against the rock, face finding purchase just long enough to help him haul her onto the ledge. They collapsed together beneath the stone overhang, gasping for breath as the rain became a solid wall of water just feet away. "Thank you," Abigail managed between breaths, acutely aware of how close she had come to death and how unhesitatingly Caleb had risked himself to save her. He nodded, unable to speak, as he clutched his injured arm. The makeshift bandage was soaked through with a mixture of rain and fresh blood. The strain of pulling her to safety had reopened the wound, and badly. "Let me see," she insisted, already reaching for her pack. The herbs and medical supplies inside had thankfully remained dry, protected by the wax canvas. Caleb didn't protest as she cut away the sodden bandage to reveal the bullet wound beneath. It looked worse than when she'd first treated it, angry and inflamed, the edges pulled apart by his recent exertion. It needed cleaning, stitching, and proper herbs to prevent infection. "I need to sew this closed," she told him, threading a needle from her kit with practiced fingers. "It will hurt." "Do what you must," he replied stoically. Abigail worked methodically despite the cramped space and poor light. She cleaned the wound with water from their skin, and a tincture of golden seal stitched the torn flesh with small, even sutures, then applied a poultice of yarrow and comfrey to help stop the bleeding and promote healing. Throughout the procedure, Caleb remained silent, the only sign of his pain, the occasional sharp intake of breath or tightening of his jaw. "You'd have made a fine doctor," he said when she finally tied off the last stitch and began wrapping a fresh bandage around his arm. "My mother wanted me to study medicine in the East," Abigail replied, securing the bandage. "She said my hands were meant for healing." Rachel was right. Caleb flexed his arm, experimentally testing the repair. "Your hands are gifted." Something in his tone made her look up from her work. Their eyes met in the dim light beneath the overhang, and for a moment the stormy pursuit, even their mission to Helena, faded into the background. There was only this small, sheltered space, and the connection growing between them, fragile yet undeniable. Abigail was the first to look away, busying herself with repacking her medical supplies. "We should rest while the storm passes," she said, her voice not quite steady. "You've lost blood, and we both need to recover our strength." Caleb nodded, settling back against the rock wall. The overhang provided just enough space for them to sit side by side, their shoulders touching, in the confined area. Outside their small shelter, the storm raged, sending cascades of water down the canyon walls and turning the stream far below into a churning torrent. "Do you think they'll keep searching for us in this?" Abigail asked, watching the fury of the storm. "Not until it passes," Caleb replied. "Even Webster's men aren't foolish enough to risk these ledges in a downpour." He shifted slightly, finding a more comfortable position for his injured arm. "But they'll resume once the weather clears. We've only bought ourselves a temporary reprieve." "How far are we from Helena now?" "As the crow flies, perhaps 40 miles. He grimaced. "But we're not crows. The terrain between here and there is some of the most difficult in the territory. Mountains, forests, rivers, all to be crossed on foot while avoiding Webster's men." Abigail digested this sobering assessment. "Do you think we'll make it?" Caleb was silent for a long moment, his eyes on the rain-lashed landscape beyond their shelter. I think, he said finally, that your mother's truth deserves to be heard. And I think we owe it to her and to Rebecca and to all of Webster's victims to trauma. It wasn't exactly a yes, but Abigail found comfort in his determination. They sat in companionable silence as the storm continued its assault on the mountains, each lost in private thoughts. Tell me about your mother, Caleb said eventually. Not about her death, but about her life. What kind of woman was she in the years after I left? The request surprised Abigail, but she found herself willing to share these memories. She was strong. She began searching for the right words to capture Rachel Sullivan's essence. Not just physically, but in spirit. She never turned anyone away who needed help, whether they could pay or not. She taught me that healing wasn't just about medicines and bandages, but about seeing people's dignity, even when they couldn't see it themselves. Caleb listened intently as Abigail shared stories of her mother, how Rachel had delivered babies during blizzards, tended wounded miners, after cave-ins, created remedies from wild plants, when conventional medicines ran short. The portrait that emerged was of a woman of tremendous courage and compassion who had found purpose in caring for a community that often undervalued her skills. She sounds like the Rachel I knew, Caleb said softly when Abigail finally fell silent, but even stronger. Life made her stronger, Abigail reflected. Or perhaps she was always that strong, and life just revealed it. She hesitated, then asked the question that had been lingering in her mind. Were you angry with her for marrying my father when she thought you were dead? Caleb considered the question carefully. Not angry, no. Hurt, perhaps. Confused, certainly. His voice took on a distant quality, as if he were looking back across the years. When I returned and found her married, expecting a child, I wanted to be angry. It might have been easier if I had been, but I could see she had built a life, made choices she couldn't unmake. So you left again. I had no right to disrupt her life, to demand explanations or make accusations. He shook his head, and there was still a war to fight. So yes, I left, requested a transfer to the furthest, most dangerous posting I could find. Looking for a bullet with your name on it, Abigail asked, recognizing the impulse from her father's descent into whiskey after her mother's death. Perhaps, Caleb admitted, but bullets found other men instead, good men with more to live for than I had. His hand unconsciously touched the medallion that had once belonged to Rachel. After Buena Vista, after everything with Webster and Rebecca, I came north, tried to lose myself in these mountains. And instead you found yourself, Abigail observed. He looked at her with surprise, as if she had articulated something he had never fully recognized. Perhaps I did. Outside their shelter, the storm's fury was beginning to abate. The thunder grew more distant, and the solid curtain of rain thinned to a steady downpour. Soon they would need to resume their journey, continuing the treacherous climb in search of a path that might lead them to Helena and justice. But for now, in this moment of fragile peace, Abigail found herself grateful for the storm that had forced them to pause to speak of things beyond survival and pursuit. In sharing memories of her mother, she felt as if Rachel's spirit had somehow joined them beneath the stone overhang, offering guidance and perhaps even blessing. In Silver Creek, Silas Sullivan made final preparations for his journey to Helena. Despite Dr. Franklin's concerns about his injury and recent sobriety, he had remained resolute in his decision. The blacksmith, Jacob Willis, had agreed to accompany him, bringing not only his skill with a rifle, but also 2 sturdy horses equipped for the difficult terrain they would face. We leave within the hour, Silas told Franklin, as the doctor checked his bandaged arm one last time. As soon as I've gathered a few personal items from the house. You're certain about this route through Miller's Gulch? Franklin asked, adjusting the sling that supported Silas's injured arm. It's the last path Webster would expect us to take, Silas confirmed. Too obvious for fugitives, as Cooper said, and I know it well from my trading days. Max Cooper, still recovering from his own wound in a cot at the back of the clinic, spoke up weakly. If you reach the territorial capital before Hawkins and your daughter ask for Marshal Bishop, tell him everything. He's one of the few officials not in Webster's pocket. Silas nodded, committing the name to memory. And if they arrive before me, Bishop will protect them, Max assured him. He's been suspicious of Webster for years, but lacked the evidence to act. As Silas prepared to leave, Dr. Franklin pressed a small bundle into his hand. Medicines, he explained, for your arm and for any other troubles you might encounter on the road. Thank you, Thomas, Silas said, his voice thick with emotion. For everything. For believing I could be more than a drunk drowning in self-pity. You were always more than that, Silas, the doctor replied gently. You just lost sight of it for a time. The two men clasped hands briefly before Silas turned to go. At the door, he paused, looking back at the wounded man on the cot. Cooper, why did you turn against Webster? Really, Max's pale face betrayed a flicker of surprise at the direct question. Because Sarah wouldn't have wanted me to become like him, he answered after a moment. And because some debts can only be paid in truth, not blood. Silas nodded, understanding the sentiment more deeply than he could express. Then he stepped out into the rain-washed evening, his mind set on the dangerous journey ahead and on the daughter he hoped to make proud, even if she never forgave him. The storm had passed, leaving the mountains washed clean beneath a sky of deepening blue. Abigail and Caleb continued their ascent, moving more carefully now that his injury had been properly treated, but still aggravated by their hasty climb. The ledges and crevices they followed angled gradually upward and around the curve of the canyon wall, eventually bringing them to the rim as twilight settled over the wilderness. From this vantage point, they could see for miles across the rugged landscape, endless forests, jagged peaks still capped with snow. Despite the summer season, and in the far distance, the faint smudge on the horizon that might be Helena. The sight was breathtaking, but it also drove home the immensity of the journey still ahead of them. We should make camp soon, Caleb said, scanning the terrain around them. There's a stand of pines about half a mile ahead that should provide decent shelter for the night. And they made their way along the canyon rim, legs aching from the day's exertions. The pine grove, when they reached it, offered welcome concealment and soft needles underfoot. Caleb insisted they build only the smallest of fires hidden within a ring of stones to prevent the light from being visible to anyone who might be searching for them. As they shared a meager meal of jerky and hardtack, Abigail found herself studying Caleb across the tiny flames. The firelight cast his features in sharp relief, emphasizing the lines that hardship had etched into his face. Yet there was a strength there too, a resilience that had carried him through loss and isolation without breaking his spirit. What will you do, she asked suddenly, after Helena, after Webster, if we succeed? The question seemed to catch him off guard. He stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. I haven't thought that far ahead, he admitted. For 5 years, I've lived day to day in the mountains. And since learning Webster was in Silver Creek, my only thought has been to bring him to justice. But if we do that, when we do that, Abigail corrected herself, you'll need something else to live for. Caleb looked up, meeting her gaze across the small fire. What about you? What will you do after Helena? Now it was Abigail's turn to consider a future she had scarcely dared imagine. A week ago, her life had seemed predestined, caring for her father until he drank himself to death, then living out her days as the town spinster, perhaps using her mother's healing knowledge to serve those who would accept help from her. I think, she said slowly, I might study medicine as my mother wanted. There are schools in the East that accept women now. Not many, but some. The idea took shape as she spoke it aloud, a dream long buried suddenly resurfacing. I could come back west afterward to a place that needs a doctor. You'd be a good one, Caleb said with quiet conviction. You have the hands for it and the heart. His words warmed her more than the small fire could. And you, she pressed, surely you don't intend to return to solitude in the mountains. I don't know, he confessed. That life has suited me. Or perhaps I've just grown accustomed to it. He poked at the fire with a stick, sending a small shower of sparks upward. But these past days, traveling with you, he seemed unable to find the right words to complete the thought. Have reminded you what it's like to be around people, Abigail suggested. Have reminded me what it's like to have a purpose beyond mere survival, he corrected. To care about something, someone beyond myself. The admission hung in the air between them, fraught with implications neither was quite ready to address directly. Instead, they let the conversation drift to more immediate concerns, the route they would take tomorrow, the supplies they would need to replenish, the likelihood of Webster's men picking up their trail again. As they prepared to sleep, arranging their meager bedding on opposite sides of the dying fire, Abigail found herself wondering about the strange twist of fate that had brought her and Caleb together. If her mother had married him instead of Silas, she would never have existed. Yet here she was journeying with the man her mother had once loved, carrying Rachel's journal and mission forward. Perhaps she thought as sleep began to claim her, There was a pattern to life's seeming chaos after all, a design too vast for any single person to discern, yet guiding them nonetheless toward meetings and partings, losses and discoveries that shaped their souls. Judge Ezekiel Webster stood at the window of his study watching the rain-swept streets of Silver Creek with cold, calculating eyes. The storm had forced his search parties to take shelter, delaying the pursuit of Hawkins and the Sullivan girl. The setback irritated him, but Webster was a patient man. He had waited 5 years to eliminate the last witness to his crimes in Mexico. He could wait a few more days to ensure the job was done properly. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," he commanded, not turning from the window. His household servant, a nervous young man who had replaced Sarah Morrison after her unfortunate disappearance, stepped into the room. "Begging your pardon, Judge, but there's a man here to see you, says it's urgent." Webster sighed with annoyance. "Who is it at this hour?" "One of the searchers, sir, Jenkins, says he has important information that couldn't wait till morning." This caught Webster's attention. He turned from the window, straightening his waistcoat. "Send him in." Jenkins entered, dripping water onto the expensive carpet. He removed his sodden hat, twisting it nervously in his hands. "Beg pardon for the late hour, Judge, but I thought you'd want to know right away." "Know what man? Speak plainly." "It's Cooper, sir. Max Cooper. He's been shot." Webster's eyes narrowed. "By whom?" "Don't rightly know, sir, but he was brought to Dr. Franklin's clinic earlier today. Rumor has it he was helping Hawkins and the Sullivan girl escape." This news disturbed Webster more than he cared to admit. Cooper had been his most trusted lieutenant, a man who carried out orders without question and knew more about Webster's operations than anyone else in Silver Creek. If he had turned traitor— "And where is Cooper now?" Webster demanded. "Still at the clinic from what I hear. Too badly wounded to move." Webster dismissed Jenkins with a curt nod, his mind already racing ahead. If Cooper had betrayed him, what information might he have shared? What evidence might he have helped Hawkins obtain? He moved to his desk and unlocked the bottom drawer with a key he kept on a chain around his neck. From it, he withdrew a custom-made Colt revolver with an ivory handle, a weapon he had used only twice before, both times to eliminate threats to his position. Tonight would be the third time. Cooper knew too much to be left alive, especially if he had decided to ally himself with Webster's enemies. As he checked the revolver's chambers, ensuring each was loaded, Webster's thoughts turned to Silas Sullivan. The man had been a broken, whiskey-soaked shell for years, presenting no threat. But his break-in at the office suggested a newfound sobriety and purpose that could prove problematic. Perhaps Webster mused it was time to tie up loose ends in Silver Creek, starting with Cooper and Sullivan before personally leading the hunt for Hawkins and the girl. He had built his empire through decisive action and ruthless elimination of obstacles. A few more deaths would hardly trouble his conscience. The judge slipped the revolver into his coat pocket and reached for his hat. The rain had stopped and a full moon was emerging from behind the dissipating clouds. Perfect conditions for a late-night visit to Dr. Franklin's clinic. Dawn broke crisp and clear over the mountains, the storm having scrubbed the air to a crystalline purity that made distant peaks seem close enough to touch. Abigail and Caleb rose early, eager to cover as much ground as possible before Webster's men could pick up their trail again. "We should reach Helena by tomorrow evening if we maintain a good pace," Caleb said as they shared the last of their jerky for breakfast. "Assuming we don't encounter any more unexpected obstacles." Abigail nodded, trying to ignore the gnawing hunger that their dwindling supplies couldn't satisfy. "And once we're there, how do we get the evidence to the right people?" "Cooper mentioned a Marshal Bishop," Caleb recalled. "Said he's been suspicious of Webster for years. He'll be our best chance at getting an official investigation started." They shouldered their packs and set off following game trails that wound through the dense forest covering the mountainside. The going was easier than their harrowing climb the day before, but still challenging enough to tax Abigail's endurance. Caleb set a relentless pace, driven by the knowledge that Webster's men would have resumed their search at first light. By midday, they had descended into a broad valley where a river meandered through meadows lush with summer growth. The sight of the clear water made Abigail realize how thirsty she had become. They paused at the riverbank to refill their water skins and rest briefly in the dappled shade of a stand of cottonwoods. "We're making good time," Caleb observed, studying the sun's position. "Another few hours and we'll reach the foothills on the other side. From there, it's mostly rolling country to Helena." Abigail nodded, too tired for extended conversation. The physical demands of their journey combined with the emotional strain of the past days had left her drained. Yet beneath the exhaustion burned a steady determination to see their mission through, to bring Webster to justice for her mother's murder and all his other crimes. As they prepared to continue their journey, a distant sound carried across the valley, the faint but unmistakable baying of hounds. "They found our trail," Caleb said grimly, instantly alert. "And they've brought dogs this time." Abigail felt a cold knot of fear form in her stomach. "How far behind us are they?" "Hard to say. Sound carries oddly in these valleys." He scanned their surroundings, mind working rapidly. "The river," he decided. "It's our best chance. Water will hide our scent." They waded into the cold current, gasping as the water rose to their waists. The river's bed was treacherous with slippery stones and unexpected depths, but they pushed forward, moving downstream as quickly as safety allowed. For nearly an hour, they followed the river's course, sometimes wading, sometimes swimming, where the current deepened. The physical effort kept Abigail from dwelling on their pursuers, but when Caleb finally led them back to shore at a point where the river bent sharply around a rocky outcropping, the hound's baying was still audible in the distance. "They're tracking along both banks," Caleb said, frustration evident in his voice. "They must have split into two groups to cover more ground." "What do we do now?" Abigail asked, wringing water from her sodden clothing. Caleb's expression was grim as he surveyed the terrain ahead. "We run," he said simply, "and we pray we reach Helena before they catch us." Dr. Franklin worked late into the night tending to Max Cooper's wound and preparing additional medical supplies for Silas Sullivan's journey. The clinic was quiet, save for the occasional groan from his patient and the soft clink of glass vials as the doctor organized his medicines. A sharp knock at the front door startled him. Visitors at this hour usually meant emergencies, a difficult birth, a mining accident, a drunken brawl gone too far. Wiping his hands on a clean cloth, Franklin moved to answer the summons. He opened the door to find Judge Webster standing on his porch, his imposing figure silhouetted against the moonlit street. "Judge," Franklin said, unable to keep the surprise from his voice, "what brings you here at this hour?" "I understand you're treating Max Cooper for a gunshot wound," Webster replied without preamble. "I've come to see him." Franklin hesitated, instinctively blocking the doorway. "He's resting now. The wound was serious. He lost a lot of blood. Any questioning should wait until morning." Webster's eyes hardened. "Step aside, doctor. This is official business. As his physician, I must insist." The judge's hand emerged from his coat pocket, the moonlight glinting off the revolver he now pointed at Franklin's chest. "I won't ask again." Franklin felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He had known Webster was dangerous, had suspected his involvement in several deaths over the years, but to see the mask of civility drop so completely was terrifying. Slowly he stepped back, allowing Webster to enter the clinic. "Where is he?" the judge demanded, keeping the gun trained on Franklin. "In the back room," the doctor replied, his mind racing. If Webster intended to kill Cooper, he would likely not leave witnesses. "Judge, whatever you're thinking, I'm not interested in your opinions, doctor." Webster cut him off. "Lead the way." Franklin had no choice but to comply, leading Webster through the clinic to the small room where Cooper lay on a cot, pale but awake. The wounded man's eyes widened at the sight of his former employer holding a gun on the doctor. "Traitors deserve no better than this," Webster said coldly, shifting his aim to Cooper. "Wait," Cooper rasped, raising a hand weakly. "You don't understand. I was trying to gain their trust to find out where they were going." Webster hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing his features. "Explain." "They have evidence against you," Cooper continued, his voice gaining strength. "Sullivan's journal land deeds. They're taking it all to Helena, to Marshal Bishop." "I know that already," Webster snapped. "What I don't know is why you were helping them." "I wasn't," Cooper insisted. "I was feeding them false information, leading them into a trap. But Hawkins was suspicious. He shot me when I tried to follow them." Franklin watched this exchange with growing unease. Cooper was lying, trying to save himself by pretending loyalty to Webster. But the doctor could see the calculation in Webster's eyes as he weighed the possibility that his lieutenant might still be useful. "And where are they headed now?" Webster demanded. "Shadow Canyon," Cooper replied without hesitation. "They think it's their best chance to reach Helena undetected." Webster studied Cooper's face, searching for signs of deception. If I find you're lying to me, I'm not, Cooper assured him. Check with your men. I told them to watch the canyon exit before I was shot. This seemed to satisfy Webster, at least temporarily. He lowered the gun slightly. And what of Silas Sullivan? What do you know of his movements? Cooper's eyes flicked, briefly to Franklin, then back to Webster. Nothing. I haven't seen him since the auction. The doctor held his breath, praying that Webster wouldn't detect the lie. If the judge learned that Silas was on his way to Helena with copies of the evidence. After what seemed an eternity, Webster nodded. Very well, Cooper. Rest and recover. I'll deal with the fugitives myself. He turned to Franklin. Doctor, a word outside. Franklin followed Webster to the clinic's front room, his heart pounding. He had no illusions about what was coming. You understand, Doctor, that this conversation never happened. Webster said, the revolver once again leveled at Franklin's chest. Of course, Judge, Franklin replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Patient confidentiality is sacred in my profession. Indeed. Webster's finger tightened on the trigger. Unfortunately, I find I can't quite trust your discretion in this matter. Franklin closed his eyes, a silent prayer on his lips. The shot, when it came, was deafening in the confined space of the clinic, but the expected pain never arrived. The doctor opened his eyes to see Webster staggering backward, a crimson stain spreading across his immaculate waistcoat. Behind the judge stood Silas Sullivan, a smoking pistol in his hand. I came back for more supplies. Silas explained, his voice surprisingly calm for a man who had just shot the most powerful figure in Silver Creek. Seems I arrived just in time. Webster collapsed to the floor, his own unfired revolver clattering from suddenly nerveless fingers. His eyes, wide with shock and fury, fixed on Silas. You, he gasped. You worthless drunk. You dare. I dare for my wife. Silas replied, still holding the pistol steady. For my daughter. For all the lives you've destroyed with your greed. Webster's lips moved as if to form another curse, but no sound emerged. His eyes glazed over, and with a final rattling breath, Judge Ezekiel Webster departed the world he had manipulated so ruthlessly. Franklin stared at the body, then at Silas, scarcely able to process what had just occurred. You killed him, he said numbly. He was about to kill you, Silas pointed out, and then Cooper, most likely. The gravity of the situation began to sink in. The law won't see it that way, Franklin warned. Wait without evidence of Webster's crimes. You need to leave now. Get to Helena with those documents before Webster's allies can cover everything up. Silas nodded, his momentary calm giving way to a grim awareness of what his actions meant. Jacob is waiting with the horses. We'll ride through the night. He glanced at the dead judge. What about him? I'll handle it, Franklin assured him. Go, find Abigail. Make sure she and Hawkins reach Marshal Bishop safely. As Silas turned to leave, Cooper appeared in the doorway, leaning heavily against the frame, his face pale with the effort of standing. Thank you, he said to Silas, for saving the doctor and me. Silas acknowledged this with a nod. Will you be all right? I've survived worse, Cooper replied with a ghost of his former confidence. Go find your daughter. Tell her, he hesitated. Tell her I'm sorry about Sarah. Tell her I understand now what her mother was fighting for. Silas clasped the wounded man's hand briefly, then disappeared into the night, leaving Franklin to deal with the body of Judge Webster and the inevitable reckoning that would follow. The pursuit continued through the afternoon and into the evening, the hounds drawing inexorably closer despite Abigail and Caleb's best efforts to throw them off the trail. By sunset, they could occasionally glimpse riders on the ridges behind them, silhouetted against the darkening sky. We can't outrun them, Caleb admitted, as they paused to catch their breath in a small grove of aspens. Not all the way to Helena. Abigail leaned against a tree, her legs trembling with exhaustion. What choice do we have? Caleb surveyed the terrain ahead, his expression hardening into resolve. There's a place about a mile from here, Devil's Backbone. It's a narrow ridge with steep drops on both sides, defensible with good sight lines. He turned to her. I can hold them off there while you continue to Helena with the evidence. No, Abigail said immediately, the very thought filling her with dread. I won't leave you to face them alone. It's the evidence that matters, Caleb insisted. Your mother's journal, the land deeds they need to reach Marshal Bishop. One of us has to get through. And it has to be me because I'm a woman, because you think I'm weaker. Because you're Rachel's daughter, Caleb corrected her, his voice softening. Because you deserve to see justice done for her, and because he hesitated, then plunged ahead. Because your life has barely begun. Mine has already seen more than its share of years. Abigail stepped closer to him, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. That's not your decision to make, she said firmly. We started this journey together. We'll finish it together. Before Caleb could argue further, the baying of the hounds intensified much closer now. They had run out of time for debate. Devil's backbone, then, he conceded. Together. But if it comes to a choice between escaping with the evidence or standing to fight, we'll decide that when the moment comes, Abigail interrupted. Now show me this defensive position of yours. They set off at a jog, Caleb leading them through the gathering darkness toward the formation he had described. The land rose steadily, the forest thinning as they climbed until they emerged onto the beginning of a narrow rocky ridge that extended for several hundred yards before connecting to the next hillside. Devil's Backbone lived up to its name, a spine of stone rising from the earth no more than 10 feet wide at its broadest point, with precipitous drops on either side. A person crossing it would be completely exposed, visible from all directions, with no cover save for a few stunted pines that had somehow taken root in the rocky soil. We'll make our stand at the far end, Caleb said, already moving onto the ridge. Anyone following will have to cross in the open. Abigail followed, trying not to look down at the dizzying drops to either side. The footing was treacherous even in daylight. In the deepening dusk, each step required careful consideration. By the time they reached the far end of the backbone, where a cluster of boulders provided some cover, the first stars were appearing in the eastern sky. Caleb positioned himself behind the largest boulder rifle at the ready. They'll come soon, he said quietly. The dogs have our scent, and they know we're cornered. Abigail knelt beside him, checking that her mother's journal was secure in her pack. How many do you think there are? Based on the hounds and what I could see, perhaps 6 men plus Webster himself if he's joined the hunt. Caleb's expression was grim in the fading light. Too many for us to fight off for long. Then we don't fight, Abigail said, a plan forming in her mind. We negotiate. Negotiate with Webster. Caleb looked at her incredulously. The man who murdered your mother, who tried to have me executed in Mexico, who would sell his own soul for power and gold. Not with Webster, Abigail clarified. With his men. Think about it, they're following orders, probably being paid well to hunt us down. But how many of them know why? How many understand what kind of man they're working for? Caleb's expression shifted from disbelief to consideration. You want to turn them against Webster. I want to show them the truth, she corrected. My mother's journal, the land deeds evidence of Webster's crimes. If they see it, some of them might question their loyalty. It's a desperate gamble, Caleb warned. Most hired guns don't care about right and wrong, only who pays better. But not all, Abigail insisted. You were a soldier. You know that men can be led astray by those in authority, but many still have a conscience beneath the uniform. Before Caleb could respond, a lantern flared to life at the far end of Devil's Backbone. Then another and another, until a line of lights marked the position of their pursuers. The hounds' baying had stopped, replaced by the more immediate threat of armed men preparing to close the trap. Hawkins, a voice called across the ridge. We know you're there. There's no escape this time. Caleb tensed, rifle ready, but Abigail placed a restraining hand on his arm. Let me try, she whispered. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded, though his finger remained near the trigger. Abigail stood, making herself visible above the boulder. We want to talk, she called back, before anyone else gets hurt. There was a pause, then murmured consultation among the lantern bearers. Finally, the same voice responded. Talk about what, Miss Sullivan. We're here to bring you back to Silver Creek by order of Judge Webster. To bring us back or to kill us, Abigail challenged. Does the judge's order specify which? Another pause, longer this time. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that you deserve to know why you're risking your lives on this ridge tonight, Abigail replied, her voice gaining strength. Why Judge Webster is so desperate to silence us. She reached into her pack and withdrew her mother's journal, holding it up so it caught the moonlight. I have evidence of Webster's crimes, fraud, land theft, murder, including the murder of my mother, Rachel Sullivan. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the whisper of the night wind across the ridge. She's lying, came a new voice, colder, more authoritative. Webster himself had joined the pursuit. The girl is delusional, and Hawkins is a deserter and murderer. $500 to the man who brings me their heads. The bounty hung in the air, tempting the men who had tracked them across mountains and valleys. Abigail felt her heart sink as several of the lanterns began to move forward onto the backbone. But then a new voice called out from behind Webster's position, a voice that made Abigail catch her breath in surprise. My daughter speaks the truth. Silas Sullivan emerged from the darkness, accompanied by the blacksmith Jacob Willis. Both men carried rifles trained on Webster. I have copies of all the evidence here. Silas continued, holding up a packet of papers. Land deeds with forged signatures. Records of bribes paid to officials. My wife's journal documenting Webster's schemes. He addressed the hired guns directly. How many of you lost friends or family to accidents over the years? How many were forced off land that was rightfully theirs? Webster has built his empire on blood and lies. Webster turned on Silas, his face contorted with rage even in the dim light. You worthless drunk. You think anyone will believe you over me? They might believe Marshal Bishop, came yet another voice as a group of mounted men appeared on the ridge behind Silas. At their head rode a tall figure in a law enforcement badge. Judge Webster, you're under arrest for the murder of Rachel Sullivan, Sarah Morrison, and numerous other crimes against the people of this territory. Webster's composure cracked entirely. With a cry of rage, he drew a revolver and fired at Marshal Bishop. The shot went wide, and in the next instant, multiple rifles answered their reports, echoing across the ridge like thunder. Webster staggered backward, clutching his chest. For a moment, he remained upright, staring in disbelief at the blood spreading across his shirt. Then he toppled sideways off the narrow ridge, disappearing into the darkness below, without even a scream. In the stunned silence that followed, Abigail found herself unable to move, unable to process the sudden reversal of their fortunes. It was Caleb who gently took her arm, steadying her as reaction set in. It's over, he said softly. It's finally over. The aftermath unfolded with dreamlike quality. Marshal Bishop's men rounded up Webster's hired guns, most of whom surrendered without resistance once their employer was gone. Silas crossed the backbone to reach his daughter, his face a study in conflicting emotions, relief, shame, hope, fear of rejection. Abigail, he said when he stood before her, his voice breaking on her name. I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed to see that you were safe. She stared at the man who had been absent in all but body for 3 years, who had sunk so low as to put her on an auction block. Yet here he stood, sober, determined, having risked his life to bring evidence that might save her. How did you find us? She asked, not yet ready to address the deeper questions between them. Dr. Franklin, Silas explained, he sent word to Marshal Bishop weeks ago after Max Cooper first came to him with suspicions about Webster. The marshal was already on his way to investigate when we arrived in Helena yesterday with the copies of the evidence. And Webster at the clinic, saw now. Silas's expression darkened. Dead, he was about to kill Franklin and Cooper. I had no choice. Abigail absorbed this information silently. So much death, so much pain, all stemming from one man's greed and another's failure to stand against it sooner. I should have protected you. Silas continued, unable to bear her silence. I should have been the father you deserved. Instead, I lost myself in the bottle and nearly lost you too. His eyes, clear of alcohol's fog for the first time in years, pleaded for understanding, if not absolution. I can't undo what I've done, but I can try to be better. To be worthy of being called your father again someday. Abigail felt Caleb's presence beside her, solid and reassuring, yet making no demands on her decision. The choice was hers alone to reject the broken man before her, or to acknowledge the spark of redemption in his actions. It will take time, she said finally. Trust isn't rebuilt in a day. Silas nodded, accepting this limited opening with visible gratitude. Time is all I ask for, a chance to prove myself. Marshal Bishop approached, then ending the difficult conversation. Miss Sullivan, Mr. Hawkins, he greeted them. Your courage in bringing this evidence forward has done a great service to the territory. Judge Webster's corruption ran deeper than any of us suspected. What happens now? Caleb asked. A full investigation, Bishop replied. Webster's associates will be questioned, his records examined. Justice will be served, though it comes too late for many of his victims. He looked at Abigail with genuine sympathy. Including your mother, Miss Sullivan. She was a brave woman. Yes. Abigail agreed, thinking of the Rachel she had known and the Rachel she had discovered through Caleb's memories in her own journal. She was. Epilogue. 1 year later, the medical college in Philadelphia was everything Abigail had hoped for: challenging, stimulating, occasionally frustrating in its traditions, but ultimately fulfilling. As one of only a handful of female students, she faced skepticism and prejudice from some quarters, but her knowledge of herbal medicine and practical experience treating real ailments had already earned her the respect of several professors. She set down her pen, flexing fingers cramped from hours of note-taking, and moved to the window of her small rented room. Outside, autumn painted the city in golds and russets, so different from the wild splendor of Montana's fall, but beautiful in its own way. A knock at her door roused her from contemplation. "Come in," she called, expecting her landlady with the evening mail. Instead, Caleb Hawkins filled the doorway, looking both out of place and oddly right in his city clothes, a concession to civilization that couldn't quite disguise the mountain man beneath. His beard was trimmed shorter now, his hair tied back neatly, but his eyes remained the same clear, direct, carrying the quiet strength she had come to rely on during their journey. "Caleb," she breathed, surprise and joy mingling in her voice. "I didn't expect you until next week." The territorial governor's business concluded earlier than anticipated, he explained, setting down his traveling bag. "He sends his regards, by the way. The Land Commission is making progress in restoring property to those Webster defrauded." Abigail nodded, pleased by the news, yet distracted by Caleb's presence after months of separation. When he had accepted the governor's appointment to the special commission investigating Webster's land schemes, they had agreed to write regularly. His letters had been a lifeline during her adjustment to city life, straightforward accounts of his work interspersed with observations of mountain wildflowers or changing seasons that told her he had not forgotten their time together. "And my father," she asked. "Have you seen him?" "3 weeks ago," Caleb confirmed. "He's doing well, still sober, still working with Dr. Franklin at the clinic. He speaks of you often." He hesitated, then added, "He's proud of you, Abigail. As am I." She felt a warmth bloom in her chest at his words. The year had brought healing on many fronts, her relationship with her father gradually mending her mother's reputation. Restored in Silver Creek, her own path finally clear before her. And then there was Caleb. The connection between them had deepened during their journey to Helena, but remained unspoken amid the chaos that followed. Now standing in her Philadelphia lodgings, the air between them seemed charged with the possibilities. "I've been thinking," Caleb said, breaking the momentary silence, "about what comes next. The commission's work will be finished by spring." "And then," Abigail prompted when he paused, "then I have a choice to make. Return to the mountains alone, or," he met her gaze directly, "or find a new purpose." Abigail understood what he was offering, not just his heart, but the willingness to build a future that accommodated both their dreams. Her medical studies, his need for wilderness, somehow balanced in a shared life. "I graduate in 2 years," she said softly. "There's a need for doctors in the Western Territories, in mining towns and settlements near native lands. Places where a man who knows the mountains might be useful." Caleb suggested, a smile touching his lips. "A man who could build a cabin with a proper herb garden." "A very large herb garden," Abigail stipulated, returning his smile. "As large as you wish," he promised, closing the distance between them. "Rachel's daughter deserves nothing less." As Caleb's arms encircled her, Abigail felt the final pieces of her life shifting into place, not erasing the past with its losses and betrayals, but building upon it a future neither she nor Caleb could have imagined in their separate solitudes. Outside her window, the last light of day gilded Philadelphia's autumn trees. Far to the west, beyond city and prairie and river, the mountains waited, wild and enduring, like the souls who had found each other in their shadow.